This is the Her Earth Medicine podcast, based around traditional Eastern medicine and naturopathic insight to support wellness and longevity. My name is Sandy Ross, and I am a naturopath and practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Chantel. Welcome to the Her Earth Medicine podcast.
Hi, Sandy. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. So I've recently completed your course, which I enjoyed so much. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to invite you on my podcast. I had to literally dust off my microphone. It's been that long since I've podcast. So you're my first one back in well over a year. So I really appreciate your time today. Do you mind me asking how you fell into being a gut expert and tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of those practitioners who has found my path through personal experience. So I've been a naturopath and a herbalist for a long time. When I was pregnant with my eldest, I started getting gut symptoms. There was a chunk of time there that was really challenging for me because I was either pregnant or breastfeeding, because then I had a second child, and I had identified Blastocystis and Dientamoeba in my gut as the culprits, and I didn't do any treatment for them because I was either pregnant or breastfeeding for a while. And then once I stopped breastfeeding, I tried to kill Dientamoeba and Blastocystis through and I just found that it made things a whole lot worse for me. So it was around that time that I first consulted with Dr. Jason Horrelak, actually. I was actually doing his kill protocols at that stage. He did have a Blastocystis eradication protocol going on at that time. I don't know if you remember that, but he had one of those, and I was on that. And he saw me getting worse, and then we just changed the approach to more of a microbiome nourishing approach. So we started focusing on supporting the beneficial microbes rather than trying to kill these bad bugs. And that's where I started to get real change in my symptoms. And then I just wanted to help everyone else with that. So it was quite a while later. Jason, he's very popular. He's very active in education, and he draws a lot of really complex cases into his clinic. And he was booked out for 3 years in advance. And so at that stage, the Gould's Clinic was like, hang on, we're going to have to do something about this. People can't wait 3 years to get help, especially since they're so sick. So he put on a team of trainees, I guess we were. We called ourselves the GIT Fellowship. And I worked there with an amazing team of gut-focused naturopaths and herbalists for just over 5 years, I think. So I might have some of these facts wrong, so you could ask Jason another time about the details, but this is how I remember him telling the story. And then the patient came back and said, I've finally got rid of blasto, but I've still got my symptoms. Like, why? Can you help me work that out? And I think Jason dug deeper around that stage and found that the patient actually had celiac disease. So had been working on eradicating blasto all those years, and no one had ruled out celiac disease.
Wow. Okay.
So that was a bit of a turning point for him, and he had a look back at the literature, and the researchers had started discussing, that there's just as many healthy people with Blastocystis and Dientamoeba as there are people with symptoms. So when they went back and did some of those studies, they were finding the healthy cohort just had similar rates of Blastocystis and Dientamoeba. So they were starting to question, is it actually a pathogen? Doesn't look like a pathogen, doesn't behave like a pathogen. It was just quite easy to identify in the stool. So the researchers think it's been scapegoated all these years. And so if someone comes to me with Dientamoeba and Blastocystis, the first thing I'll do is try and work out actually what's going on, because I don't think they're the culprits.
Yeah.
And they're usually, well, they're not. And even if, you know, we do know that there are more pathotype strains of Blastocystis. You know, there's all those subtypes of blasto. And once we get above like subtype 5, so it might be subtype 7, I think, or subtype 8, they think that they do behave a little bit more pathogenic. Even if you did have one of those subtypes, the literature does really clearly show that antibiotics is ineffective. So you could, like Jason's patient did, you can be killing away and still not get anywhere. So a kill approach is really not a great idea if there's blasto. And most people I find that have identified blasto through metagenomic testing, which can identify the subtypes, then it's not one of the more pathotypes anyway. It's usually subtype 3 in there, which is believed to be non-pathogenic. They're calling blasto the apex predators in the gut ecosystem. So you understand that concept? Yeah.
You can elaborate, because we're basically answering one of my questions down the bottom, but we can definitely delve.
Yeah, we've jumped straight down there. Okay. We'd go with it. So the apex predators in our ecosystems are like the sharks or the wolves, yeah? So they keep the numbers of other species in the ecosystem in check so that they don't overgrow and take over the ecological system. So that's the current thinking around Blastocystis, is that it's an apex predator in the gut, and it's present in dysbiotic ecosystems in order to help to balance things again.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's a bit of a relief to all my Northern Rivers patients that always come up and test with blasto or Dientamoeba. But I've got a few more questions on that, which we might get to at the end. So we'll circle back there. Can I maybe bring you back to the beginning, because I kind of want to go through and really like just debunk and make it real clear, and even go right into layman's terms for some of these things, because some of these terms that you might have even been mentioning, some people might be going, oh, what's this? And so look, I want to break it down really simply, because you did do such a great job at simplifying, because I did Jason's course and I loved it and it was great, but it was very fast and intense and there was no time to break it down, and I think you do that so beautifully. So can we maybe start by actually defining the difference? And I didn't actually know this until I did Jason's course, the difference between the microbiome and the microbiota.
Yeah, sure. People often use them interchangeably, but if we want to be really correct, the microbiota is the actual microbes that are in the ecosystem, in any ecosystem. It's called the microbiota. And then the microbiome is more the functionality of the ecosystem, or the function, you know, like the short chain fatty acids and the other metabolites that are being produced. So mostly when we're talking about microbiome, we're referring to both. We're referring to the microbes and the processes that go on in that space because of the microbes. So that's in it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and so within the microbiome, what is it we have? So we have the fungi, the yeast, the virus, the bacteria. Do you want to just clarify all those things?
Yeah, you nailed it. Yep. I think that's it, isn't it? And the eukaryotes as well. We didn't mention eukaryotes. So there is, it's not just bacteria. Yeah, that's the main thing to remember. So we do have a virome. So that's the viral species that live in an ecosystem. And there's the fungal microbiome as well. And, you know, like there's a lot of kill approaches directed toward fungal species in our industry as well. So like people who believe they have like systemic candida. And look, vulvovaginal candidiasis is definitely an issue and something that requires treatment. But that systemic candida isn't really able to be adequately tested for in my opinion, with rigorous science that has, been peer-reviewed. And it's unlikely that that's what's going on. And if we're killing stuff with these broad spectrum antifungals, we don't actually, we're only just identifying this fungal biome that we have, and we're killing it already, and we don't really know what role it has in our health and well-being. But they're starting to find that it is quite likely to have some key health benefits for us. So it's important to protect those species as well.
I think when people can think of it like the terrain approach and just imagining the rainforest with, the mushrooms and everything like that growing out, and it is quite hard to just isolate and just kill one thing without damaging everything else that's around it. It's kind of a nice way that I think about it and explain it to my patients.
Yeah, I like to think about my ecosystem as a rainforest as well. Yeah, or a garden. The gardeners really get it, because there's so much going on in the soil, and the gardeners who have moved into a property and it's not had a garden before know how many years it takes to get the soil health up enough in order for their plants to flourish. So if you just stick a plant in and water it, it'll do okay and throw out a couple of flowers. But if you start to nourish those microbes in the soil and the nutrient in the soil, you get a much more flourishing garden. Yeah, so rainforest and the garden analogy is lovely.
I love the garden analogy. I remember you talking about that in the course, and I'm a gardener. My parents have a plant nurse, so I understand that, but I feel like a lot of my patients and clientele that doesn't quite sit with them. So I've used the rainforest quite a bit. The garden approach, I really like that as well.
Yeah, and it's not just like plants and microbes in a rainforest. We've got all the birds and all the animals, and there's so many different species there. So it's a nice way to think about the ecosystem. Yeah.
What about the types of testing? So this is something I've had to switch around from recently in the last year of practicing. So we've got, qPCR, 16S, metagenomics. Could you potentially go through these types of testing and just explain what they are?
Yeah, sure. So the qPCR testing is basically, it uses like a specific probe to identify a microbe. So with that one, we kind of will be able to identify a particular bug, yeah? And you need to have the probe for that bug in order to identify it. That is great if we're looking for a particular pathogen, yeah? So it's used to identify Blastocystis and Dientamoeba and Giardia and Campylobacter, a lot of those kind of microbes. And so it's pretty good at identifying those. It's quite accurate at identifying those microbes because it is it's like the specific key for that microbe, and it's either there or it's not. And it doesn't tell us how much of the microbe is there. It just tells us yes or no. Is it there or is it not? So we can't really detect overgrowths or anything like that with that test. The 16S testing is so this is where we have to have a little basic understanding about how DNA works. And so we've got the whole DNA strand, and then we have this one section of the DNA called the 16S section in the DNA. And we can use that piece of DNA to identify different microbes. So it's using one slice of DNA in order to detect a species like bifidobacteria or E. coli. So that's fairly accurate testing. It is its downside, I guess, is that because it's just using one piece of the 16S, some microbes have really similar looking 16S, so they kind of get dumped into the same bucket, yeah? So we can see that with different E. coli species and different bifidobacteria species that they'll all be put into the one bucket because we're only looking at the 16S. And so that's like a lot of the microbiome science was based on the 16S technology. So a lot of, the information we have now is based on research from that kind of testing. And then in the last 10 years or so, we've had the metagenomics testing come through quite strongly. And metagenomics, or shotgun metagenomics, it's also called deep sequencing. So that will map the whole genome of the microbe. So it's much more specific because we're looking at the whole gene rather than this one slice of the gene. So what we're finding with this newer kind of technology is that we're being much more specific with the microbes that are there. So I'll use E. coli as a good example. So E. coli is a pathobiont, which means, it hangs out in a healthy ecosystem in low numbers, but if it has an opportunity, it'll overgrow and can cause infections. But there are some E. coli that are less likely to cause problems and are non-pathogenic. And then there's others that are more virulent and more likely to cause a very nasty infection. And so the shotgun metagenomics is helping us to tease that out. Yeah, so we can see whether our patients have a more benign E. coli hanging out in their ecosystem or a really gnarly one that's quite likely to cause them a lot of issues. And the same is happening with lactobacillus. So lactobacillus is being renamed and reclassified at the moment because there were a lot of microbes that were named lactobacillus because of what they did rather than how they looked in their structure. And so that's being teased out a bit at the moment. So there's a big renaming thing of lactobacillus at the moment. So a lot of the lactobacillus we see in the gut microbiome are no longer lactobacillus. So we won't see them in the metagenomic tests that are using the more advanced databases that their tests are based on.
But they'll still show in like 16S that are dominant for lacto and bifido.
Yeah, they'll still show in 16S, and there's some really common ones. So like Lactobacillus rhodesiae is one that's been reclassified. It shows up a lot in 16S, and it's not a lactobacillus. It doesn't give the same health benefits as lactobacillus does. I don't think there's any other 16S tests in Australia.
GI map?
Oh yeah, the GI map, they often use a combination of 16S and PCR.
Yeah.
I think the GI map as well.
Naturopath also do a combination one as well too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think is CDSA is the qPCR, correct?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, the CDSA does.
I used to run them all the time early on. I've been using them.
Did you?
Yeah. Since the get-go.
Yeah, see, I started out with microbiome testing when I was working with Jason. So I jumped over all of that and never did any of those tests. And so the shotgun metagenomics, if we want to use the most advanced microbiome testing, which is what I would recommend because this is where the science is. This is the spearhead of the science right now. So everything we know about the microbiome now, all the studies are using the more advanced technology. And if they're not, then they're pretty strongly critiqued for that because it's so much more accurate down to the species level when we're assessing what's going on in an ecosystem. So in Australia, we're really lucky to have Microba or cobiome, and they're in Queensland. I think they're associated with Queensland University. One of the reasons I really love cobiome Microba is because they, at heart, they are a bunch of nerds. They're a bunch of scientists, and they just love the microbiome just as much as I do. And, they're constantly evolving because of that science background that they have, and they're a research lab as well. So I would say, in my opinion, and I'm not affiliated with them, I don't make any money from them. In my opinion, they're the best lab in the world. I've worked with a lot of labs globally, and those guys, I think, are doing the most accurate testing, the most accurate reporting. Their bioinformatics always checks out when I cross-reference. So the bioinformatics, for those who don't know, is like when you have this kind of really specific testing, like the shotgun metagenomics testing, you need pretty heavy duty computers to make that data meaningful. And the bioinformatics is how the data is being made meaningful, basically. So all the programming that it runs through in order to give you a clear indication at the end, like, you know, short chain fatty acid production or butyrate production or things like that. So that's the bioinformatics. And it's always, I've found, very on point with what I'm seeing in the microbiome. So there's other labs around the world that use shotgun metagenomics, and their bioinformatics does not seem nearly as accurate.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing new things since using there. I was like, whoa, high secretory IgA. And I spoke with Dr. Brad, and he was just saying, you know, it's the type of preservatives and stuff that they can carry for the testing, which before they've never been able to do, because I've never ever seen high secretory IgA before using microbiome.
Yes.
And I've also found their tech support amazing too. And I think there was a few of them actually in the course with Jason. And you know, they were always savvy and asking lots of questions too. So they do have very good education, which makes it a bonus when you're a practitioner using this, and then you have questions that someone can educate and give you guidance alongside what you're doing. I actually did do the microbiota training when they first came out years ago through Metagenomics. I went up to Brisbane and did it, but they didn't have the functional markers back then. I think that's where the naturopaths really, like, we love it. We love to see what the gut, you know, is doing inside, whether there's high cal protectant, the secretory IgA, the zonulin, those kinds of things. I think that's probably where some of the other testing had its benefits with that. But now microbiota includes all that, which is great.
Yeah, and in my experience, you know, I've used a lot of the other labs that have those functional markers, and because they are actually quite time sensitive, especially calprotectin and secretory IgA, and I've found them elevated previously, and then double checked, you know, sent my patient off for a retest with their GP, and it was normal. Yeah, so yeah, I'd had a few of those experiences, and then Microba brought in their functional markers. And I agree, the secretory IgA and the calprotectin on there is gold.
Talk about diversity and richness, or start with diversity, because I think this is something that some of the other tests obviously don't offer, and understanding the benefits to this. And, you know, I know that some of the African tribes have over 750 different species versus our 100 and something or 200 and something species. But for those that have no idea what I'm talking about, could you elaborate on this, please?
Yeah, so diversity is like a statistical model that they use in all ecological systems to measure, it's like a measure of how many species there are and their relative abundance to each other. So let's go to the rainforest. The diversity will say, okay, there's this many different species in the ecosystem, say 200 there. And if you've got like a higher diversity, there won't be one or two microbes or species dominating the ecosystem. Yeah, like so in a plantation forest, the diversity will go down because it's fairly monoculture. There's just one dominant species there and a few other species that have popped up in the soil underneath. So diversity goes down with one or two species dominating the ecosystem. And so the species richness is pretty much just a count of the species. It's how many species there are. And yeah, you're right. Like for a healthy-ish Western microbiome, we see a few hundred species there. I like to get my patients up to around, you know, 260 or something. For my unwell patients, I quite often will see them well below 100 if they've come to me with a lot of health issues. And so the reason it's important is because a higher microbial diversity is generally associated with better health, yeah? So less autoimmune disease, less metabolic disease, less cardiovascular disease, and those kinds of things. So, and that's just diversity. That's not looking at specific microbes at all. It's just diversity.
We want the permaculture gut.
Yes, we want the permaculture gut. We want a lot of species there, and we want them to be well balanced. Yeah.
So you mentioned getting patients up to, I can't remember what number, did you just say 350? Ideally, you'd want them at? Is that?
Oh, yeah, I like to get them up to around the mid 300s. Yeah, yep.
So what
I might not tell them that if they've only got 50 species there, because that can feel like a long road, but that's what I've got my eye on.
Yeah, and I have seen, like, in some of my oncology patients sit quite low, but it's surprising the diverse range that you are seeing in patients, and some patients feel fine and they are sitting under 100. And so that's a great tool that we have, that we can use our, amazing stuff that we have in our compounding ranges to populate that. So what are some of the things that you would use, and like how long are you taking to try and bump that up in treatment, I'm talking about?
Yeah, good question. I have this conversation a lot, but can I just say first, sometimes when we start working with our patients who need help with diversity, this happens a lot when you first start out, and it can be a little disheartening. So I just want to name this up. If there's a high number of pathobionts in the ecosystem, or let's just call them bad bugs for these, if there's a high amount of bad bugs and we start treating the ecosystem, sometimes diversity will go down initially, because the bad bugs are dropping away and we haven't lifted the good bugs yet. So it's important to name that up, because quite often the first part of the treatment, that does happen with microbiomes that are extremely dysbiotic and have an overgrowth of inflammatory microbes in them. And so to go back to your question about what to use to feed. So look, I love to work with diet and lifestyle medicines, but quite often the patients I see aren't able to approach them straight up because maybe they have a lot of gut inflammation. They usually do. So a lot of my patients are on heavily restricted diets because they're getting food reactions. So I usually start patients off with a really gentle prebiotic fiber like partially hydrolyzed guar gum, because that's not going to cause a lot of gas production. It's just going to feed butyrate producing bacteria, and those bacteria will increase the amount of butyrate being produced, which will start to reduce the inflammation in the gut. So I'll usually start there with an inflamed gut. And then I like to bring in the polyphenols. And polyphenols are great in the diet. You can just use berries and green tea. And I like to tell my, cacao. Is that what's in your cup?
No, that's green tea.
It's green tea, yeah.
But I have matcha every morning as well, and that's a very strong polyphenol. So, but this is a watered down one.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I love the green tea every day as well. So I like to bring in polyphenols next because they seem to be fairly well tolerated too.
Yeah, and they're delicious.
Yeah, and they're gorgeous. And I like to say to my patients, I want you to look at your plate or your bowl and see a rainbow. Yeah, and that's, while we're working on expanding your diet, maybe it'll just be blueberries and red dragon fruit for now because they're quite gentle on an inflamed gut, but we'll expand that with time. And then there's all the others, there's the inulin phos. That's usually the last one I'll introduce because most people with inflamed guts will find it quite active and causes bloating and gas. But usually they can get it in by the time we get to the end of our treatment. And then there's the GOS and the human milk oligosaccharides as well. They're the main ones I use. I sometimes throw in acacia fiber. There's plenty of other ones, the pectins, everything like that, but they're harder to get, more expensive, and the polyphenols and the PHGG and inulin and GOS will do most of the work we want them to do, and they're fairly easily accessible. As far as time frame goes, look, it depends on the person. It's like, how long's a piece of string? I get that question a lot from my patients. Most of my patients are fairly unwell, and I like to give them a 2-year time frame. But in the long term, in order to restore a disrupted gut microbiome and disrupted gut function, it usually takes a couple of years by the time they feel like, oh yeah, I'm feeling great. I have had young patients respond really quickly to treatment. And absolutely, we know that, from that our naturopathic principles, the longer you've had a condition, the longer it's going to take in order to heal and resolve that. So the older patients do take longer. And unfortunately, for our older patients, so over 50, the microbiome does naturally decline, just like everything else in an aging body. So older patients will need to continuously care for their ecosystem so it doesn't just keep sliding downhill.
Yeah. Can we just touch on, because I feel like it might be a fairly new prebiotic come to light. I know it's been around for a while, but I think potentially some naturopaths aren't utilizing it or understand with HMOs. Can we talk about?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so HMOs are amazing. So it stands for human milk oligosaccharides, and it is not actually human milk in there. It is identical to the oligosaccharides found in human milk. So they found a way to replicate it. And the reason it is, it's being used a lot in infants and young children, because an infant biome is, a healthy infant biome is dominated by bifidobacteria. And a lot of infants that have had disruption to their microbiomes have very depleted levels of bifidobacteria or no bifidobacteria in their ecosystem. And it's very effective at boosting up bifidobacteria. It's what we call a bifidogenic prebiotic. It's really good for helping to heal a leaky gut as well, to support those tight junctions in a leaky gut. And I just find it's generally really well tolerated compared to other prebiotics. So I tend to use it because it's a bit more expensive. I tend to use it with my patients who can't tolerate GOS or inulin, and I'm really wanting to support the growth of microbes like bifidobacteria, or also support that gut barrier function.
Yeah, I'm loving using them. Shall we dive a little bit into the microbial metabolites and touch on them? Because that is something that obviously Microba is offering as well. And, maybe you can just go through the different metabolites that we often see with those kind of tests and what they mean.
Yeah, sure. So a microbial metabolite, the way I understand it, or the way I explain it to my patients, is basically something that microbes produce. And we've got good metabolites and we've got not so good metabolites. And so Microba does with their bioinformatics, so they report on beneficial metabolites and harmful metabolites. And it's not like they're not actually measuring the metabolites, this is my understanding of it. They're not actually measuring the metabolites, they are measuring the microbiome's potential for those metabolites based on the microbes that are in the ecosystem. Yeah. And so the common ones I'm keeping an eye on are, from a beneficial perspective, I really like to keep an eye on butyrate. I really like to keep an eye on IPA as well. But mostly I focus in on butyrate production as my favoured metabolite to look after, because it has such an impact on reducing inflammation, both in the gut and system-wide. And then as far as the more harmful, there's more beneficial metabolites, of course, but I'll just touch on a couple. And the harmful ones, like we've got LPS or the Hexa-LPS, so that's quite a nasty metabolite that can contribute to gut damage and system-wide inflammation. We've got hydrogen sulfide as well, so that can cause gut damage as well and contribute to intestinal permeability issues. And quite often people with high levels of hydrogen sulfide production will have really stinky farts as well.
Maybe.
So the hallmark. Yep. Which ones have I missed? The branched chain amino acids and the trimethylamine, they are inflammatory as well in the body, and can often we see high levels of those more inflammatory metabolites with either an ecosystem that has copped a very bad knock from either long-term antibiotics or recurrent antibiotics or a heavily restricted low-fiber diet, or an ecosystem that hasn't had access to much fiber. So someone who's been on the carnivore diet long-term or something like that. Yeah.
Mm. And that's a good one. I think carnivore is obviously trending. A lot of people feel a lot better in the beginning because obviously they're stopping that fermentation in their gut, but knowing the long term on what it can do.
Yeah, and I think also the carnivore diet, so I see a lot of patients who've tried it, and do stick with it because of those initial benefits that they feel from it. And I think it's like so many diets that it just cuts out a lot of processed food. Yeah. And I think that's why people feel better initially. But what we see over time with the microbiome, because of the increased production of those branched chain amino acids and the trimethylamine and hydrogen sulfide from the microbes that will tend to flourish in a high animal protein diet, is people end up with more intestinal permeability issues and chronic autoimmune type diseases setting in over time, and often elevating cholesterol levels and blood lipids as well. Yeah.
There's one thing I've learned from metagenomics, the the recommendations with the diet that they give from Microba is plant-based diet. Lots of things are Mediterranean plant-based diet. It's going to help a lot of things for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely what the research says about the microbiome. And if we're going to work with microbiome, it's really important that we understand that the best diet for a healthy ecosystem is a plant-based diet. It's not to say you can't eat meat, but that predominantly you're eating plants.
Yeah. And I think that's important, eat meat, but where's your fiber? Where's your color? Where's all those polyphenols? So can we touch on two of those metabolites? IPA, because that was something I was new to coming back to using Microba, and then Hexa-LPS.
Yeah. So IPA, what's it stand for again? Indole propionic acid. Yeah. So it's a beneficial metabolite. It's really strongly antioxidant. So it's like green tea on steroids. Yeah. We know it's neuroprotective, which is really cool. And it's
low.
What's that?
Mine was low. I was like,
oh, okay. Yep.
Plains baby brain.
Yeah, yep. And it also influences metabolic health positively. So it improves insulin sensitivity. And it's involved in gut integrity as well. It helps to strengthen the those gap junction proteins, but also there's a bit of evidence saying that it supports the growth of butyrate producing microbes. So the more IPA you have, the more Faecalibacterium and Roseburia you have, which are quite excellent butyrate producers, which is also involved in barrier function and a bunch of other stuff as well. So yeah, it's produced with or by a conversion of tryptophan, so dietary tryptophan. So having a diet rich in soy. I'm going to mention soy and legumes first before I mention eggs and turkey. And I'm going to mention dairy last, yeah, because all of those things contain tryptophan. Eggs are great if we're eating good eggs, but if we're not eating good eggs, then they can be a little bit more inflammatory. Turkey's fine as well. It's not a common food for us Australians, much more common for my American patients. But yeah, if you really boost up the legumes in your diet and have good quality eggs coming in from free range chickens who have access to lots of greens, then you can boost your IPA up.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I think also it can be hard to get good turkey meat here as well. I'm sure there's Ingham around, but I don't know the quality of that.
Yeah, that was the other thing. I've not seen any good turkey around other than Ingham.
Yeah.
Not seen any organic, nice
No,
organic
you can
turkey.
get it in the health food shops. It's very pricey, and I have amazing chickens. Our chickens are fed better than my children sometimes. So I'm always like, oh, how's my IPA? But I think I previously used to eat a lot more vegetarian style diet. I eat a lot more meat these days, so that probably fits in there.
Yeah, bring back the soy, bring back the tofu if you haven't already.
Yeah, no, I haven't. Okay, what about Hexa-LPS? I'd love to know how you approach it and what it is.
Yeah, okay. So Hexa-LPS is, so the LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide. And lipopolysaccharide is basically part of the cell structure of proteobacteria, basically. So proteobacteria in the microbiome are normal and healthy in low levels. And certain ones will contain the Hexa-LPS, which is a particularly inflammatory form of lipopolysaccharide that can cause cell damage and contribute to what's called endotoxemia, which is the absorption of the endotoxin, which is the LPS, into the bloodstream, and it's like the opposite of an antioxidant. Basically, it's going to cause damage, cellular damage everywhere it goes in the body, and it does get everywhere. It gets across the blood-brain barrier as well. So quite often, my patients with chronic fatigue, brain fog, those kinds of symptoms have high levels of Hexa-LPS producing microbes, otherwise usually known as pathobionts. So we've got some species of E. coli, Klebsiella, C. diff, those kinds of microbes all have Hexa-LPS as part of their structure. And what do I do about it was the next part of the question. Yeah, so
GOS. I know GOS is a big one for it, but are there other things?
yeah, GOS is great. Look, this is one area where so I don't use a strong kill approach in my practice. I use a fairly strong restoration approach, but this is one area where I'll start to bring in what was taught to me by Jason as selective herbal antimicrobials. Yeah, so really gentle but effective antimicrobials that can help to reduce numbers of those pathobionts while we're trying to restore the beneficial microbes. So ultimately, we want to use GOS and other prebiotics to feed the beneficial microbes because they're going to take up the space and create an environment where the pathobionts don't want to live. So feeding up microbes like bifidobacteria and other beneficial microbes will have an acidifying effect on the colon. A lot of those bad bugs don't like an acidic environment, and just crowding them out in general. Yeah, so feeding up the beneficial microbes in your ecosystem will take up the space so that those bugs can't overgrow. So it's important to be feeding in the background, but if someone's really sick and really because they cause so much inflammation in the body, it can be hard. Like I'm going to recommend they eat legumes 5 times a week, but someone who's that unwell and has that much gut inflammation is going to suffer terribly if I put them on that diet, a high fiber diet in the early days. So using a gentle kill approach can help to get over that threshold so that they can start to tolerate more of those high fiber foods and prebiotics that we want to build in to boost up the beneficial bacteria. I just want to take the opportunity, sorry, I am talking over the top, I think, but I just want to take the opportunity to say as well, while we're talking about kill approaches, that I don't use berberine or
Okay. Oh, I was about
berberine-containing
to ask
herbs.
you that. So you've read my mind.
And I don't use oil of oregano or
You think so,
thyme
right?
oil or clove oil. They're just too strong. They're all too strong in the ecosystem. Look, if you're really experienced, there are times where you may use a little bit of berberine, but I'm really cautious with it. And I usually would pulse it if I'm going to use it.
Yeah.
So I use it for a short period and I'd be protecting the ecosystem in the background. And it's great for those metabolic disorders. We know it is
Yeah.
quite fabulous, but that research on diabetes also tells us that it does disrupt the
Mm.
gut microbiome. So we have to be really careful with berberine and berberine-containing herbs. And traditionally, they were only ever used short-term for
Yeah.
infections.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's important to remember that as well. And there's plenty of alternatives that aren't going to disrupt
Mm.
the colonic ecosystem that will be as effective as well.
I mean, even Kerry
Your herbalist.
from MediHerb will always talk about, the pulsing effect on using your antimicrobials. So I know what you're going to say, but what is some of your favorite? I know there's one herb in particular that are amazing, but what are some of your favorite antimicrobials?
Yes, so I am a true student of Dr. Jason Horrolack. So he's influenced my herbal prescribing quite strongly. So pomegranate husk is probably number one. I quite like the whole fruit of pomegranate as well. Like I'd love it if someone would produce a product that was the whole, the husk and the fruit, because then you've got some amazing prebiotic polyphenols in there as well as the antimicrobial effects of the husk. But yeah, I use pomegranate husk usually as a tincture, but if the patient can't tolerate alcohol, we can usually get it as a powder. There's some good tablets out there with pomegranate husk in them now as well. I do use oregano, clove, and thyme a lot as well, just never as essential oils. They're just too strong as essential oils. Even as herbal tinctures, they're quite strong, and your patients will definitely complain about your formula if it's got clove and oregano and thyme in it. But I use those quite a lot as well. I really like maritime pine in my gut mixes. I love saffron in there too, especially for those patients that are really struggling with gut-brain axis stuff, and you can see the stress is really playing into it. But it's a lovely gut anti-inflammatory as well and digestive tonic. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of those can be utilized quite low dose as well, and pomegranate not so much. That's a bit of a filler in the bottle, but
yeah, it does take a bit of space.
Even clove, so you can fit a few in there, which is really nice.
Yeah.
And I'm loving all this new research around the kill approach and antimicrobials and everything like that, because for years I have been using it, and people do feel better. And I think obviously to a degree you are obviously killing off whatever you need to, but the long-term effects on the microbiome, I think that's really important to consider in our patients, because that's really what we're looking at is, the long-term picture of their health. So shall we maybe talk a little bit about those parasites? Because we've touched on it in the beginning. You've kind of given us your history and stuff like that, but let's go into it a little bit more, because I do see go around a lot on social media, everyone, I guess promoting that all everyone's health issues are, alluding to just being from the blasto and the Dientamoeba. And I think we need to debunk that a little bit more. So I can't remember exactly what you said in the beginning, but do you want to maybe explain to us once again and reiterate on that, why we don't need to potentially kill them off?
Yeah, so the researchers are thinking that they're these apex predators, as we discussed earlier. So they're actually having a beneficial function in the ecosystem, and that they're quite common to show up in a dysbiotic ecosystem in order to have a balancing effect. Look, there's still more research coming out, but it's very clear from the literature that there is just as much Blastocystis and Dientamoeba in the healthy cohort as there is in the cohort with gut symptoms. So with that piece of information, we have to ask ourselves, well, is that actually a problem or is something else going on? With the patients who come to me with Blastocystis or Dientamoeba or both, quite often if you've got blasto, you've also got Dientamoeba. Quite often I find that on further investigation, they have SIBO, yeah? And that's actually the issue. And we look at their ecosystem in more detail and we're able to uncover, you know, the pathobionts that are quite likely causing their SIBO as well. And focusing on that is usually how I get good results with those patients. And I think that's why patients will sometimes initially respond well to a kill approach for Dientamoeba and Blasto, because there's SIBO in the background. And, you know, the approaches are similar for SIBO as they are for Blasto. But what you'll see as well is it'll just come back. The symptoms will just come back. And that's because SIBO has really high recurrence rates and Blasto and Dientamoeba are quite resistant, to being killed. So if we retest, we'll find that they're still there. But if we went ahead and retested SIBO, we would find that it's quite likely recurred. There's quite high recurrence rates for SIBO. So for me, the treatment approach is really to address SIBO, but I always think of SIBO now as being a secondary condition. SIBO's there because of something else. And quite often for our patients, there's a lot of different reasons for us to have SIBO and get SIBO recurrence, but quite often it's because of colonic dysbiosis. So there's an imbalance in the colon, which is predisposing to a small bowel overgrowth, or chronic stress and anxiety. I find that if we address those two things, usually we don't have so much problem with recurrence of SIBO or difficulty getting rid of it.
Okay, and so, I mean, this probably just goes back to exactly what you just said with what you should focus on instead of the parasites, but you also see a lot of, I guess, blame put on Dientamoeba and Blasto for anemia, iron anemia specifically.
Yep. So it comes back, in my opinion, comes back to SIBO again, because there's with SIBO, so those who are listening who don't know, SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So it's like the bugs are growing in the wrong place. They're growing in the small bowel rather than large bowel. And if that happens, if you've got a colony in the small bowel, it can inhibit your absorption of nutrients, including iron. Depending on where it's growing, of course, some people don't have SIBO and don't have an iron deficiency, but it's quite common to see. Yeah.
And I guess with SIBO, you have to test, don't you? Because there can be very different results, and that's an extremely different approach depending on what comes back through. So maybe we can just quickly touch on SIBO testing there.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, I like to test. I will always encourage my patients to test. I do like to test, and there are different types of SIBO. So we can have methane dominant SIBO, we can have hydrogen dominant SIBO, we can have a mixed SIBO that's got a bit of methane and hydrogen, and we can have a hydrogen sulfide SIBO as well, although we can't directly measure hydrogen sulfide SIBO. There's no test that is going to adequately assess for that. And there is talk out there about SIFO, so small intestinal fungal overgrowth. But the SIBO, the herbs we use for SIBO treatment are antifungal anyway. There's a really big crossover. So I'm not too concerned whether it's a fungal or a bacterial overgrowth. But testing's great because that will kind of direct the treatment. So you would use a different treatment at a different time frame if it was methane SIBO or if methane was involved. as opposed to a hydrogen dominant SIBO, and the same with hydrogen sulfide. So that's like a diagnosis of elimination, and you can assess for that by what's not there rather than what is there, and the offensive smelling flatulence or breath comes with it. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That really summarizes that well. Last question. It's kind of off topic, but it's also relatable. What would be your best things to prevent gastroenteritis or barley belly or something like that? If a patient hadn't gone and done any functional testing, would there be some things that you would say you could do, as a prophylactic?
So there's great research looking at bimunogos for preventing traveller's diarrhea. So that's what I would do. I would take bimunogos the whole time I was in Indonesia or Bali or India or wherever I was going.
What dosaging are you doing for that?
So the Bimuno comes in the sachet. So you just do a sachet a day unless you get an infection, and then you increase it to a sachet twice a day. Yeah.
Okay, great. I mean,
I quite like taking a little bottle of herbs as well, because some of those microbes can be pretty full on, and need a little more encouragement if they do take hold. So I like to do like a mix of the clove, oregano, pomegranate, something like that to take along to help shift something if it does end up taking hold.
well, that's great. I've never heard of that. That's fantastic. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the course that, I think I did it, what was the last intake? But it's coming up very soon, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So the thing I loved the most about working with Jason and the team at Gould's Natural Medicine was it was the mentoring. But the real gold for me was working with real cases, and I just it just really solidified my my learning and my practice, to go over case after case after case. So that's what I'm wanting to offer people. So there'll be education around that, but primarily I want prackies to bring their cases and bring the cases that they're struggling with so that I can help them with those. So we're starting on the 4th of March. And I've got it broken up into like 2 terms. So there's the first cohort will have 4 sessions over three months, and we'll finish up at the start of June, and then we'll go back in. So you can do one or both cohorts, and we go back in August through to October as well. And we'll be talking about mostly SIBO in the first cohort and mostly microbiome in the second cohort, but you can't really separate them out. There'll just be a bit more education about SIBO in the first one, and a bit more education about microbiome in the second one.
Yeah, and I really encourage anyone listening that is a practitioner that works with their gut and hasn't done any gut training, proper gut training, that they should jump on board this, because you've got an early bird discount as well.
Oh, yeah, I do. I've got an early bird going until next Sunday. So not this Sunday coming, but the following one. The early bird's open till. Yeah.
Super affordable course anyway. It's amazing. I love doing it, and it's really nice having you as a lecturer and teacher and stuff like that, because you really just go over everything. I wouldn't say in a simple manner, but you break it down really nicely.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. That is all my questions, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and go through all that and debunk everything about the gut microbiome. And at some point I'd love to invite you back on when I can think of some more things to pick from your brain. But yeah, thanks so much, Chantel, for taking the time out and coming on my podcast again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sandy. It's been really lovely chatting with you about the gut microbiome.
And before we finish, I better ask, can everyone find you? Where can they find your course?
Oh, so on my Instagram, it's up there, and there's a link in the bio to the course. I've got a Facebook page as well, and my website. Oh, yes. So my website address is just chantelyates.com.au. And Chantel is spelt Chantel.
Yes, I've got that.
No S's and no double L's.
Whoops, I did that a few times. Okay, thanks so much, Chantel. I really appreciate your time.
No worries. Thanks, Sandy. See ya.
Thank you for tuning in to the Her Earth Medicine podcast. If our discussions have provided you with value, we'd love for you to leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform or share the podcast with your wellness friends. If you're ready to take proactive steps towards your health, with over 15 years of clinical experience, you can visit us at herearthmedicine.com to explore consultation options, enroll in courses, or browse our wellness shop. You can also follow us on Instagram at Her Earth Medicine. Until our next episode, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep nurturing your mind, body, and spirit.